After a disastrous stretch, Gukesh turns things around with a very nice attacking game against one of his fellow prodigies.
d4. Queen's pawn opening line. The queen's pawn opening move is somewhat slower than the popular e4 because white will not be able to castle for 3 more moves. Its advantage is that it gives white more control over tactical surprises and often provides more lasting initiative and pressure. Knight f6. Indian defense opening line. The immediate development of the knight is the most supple response to the queen's pawn opening, allowing transposition into virtually every type of defense at black's disposal. c4. Indian defense opening line. White with c4 tries to restrict black's options in attacking the center. e6. Indian defense opening line. This is one of those flexible positions where decisions have yet to be made as to the direction the middle game will take. This position can become a Nimzo Indian defense, a Queen's Gambit accepted declined, a Queen's Indian defense, or a Benoni defense. Knight c3. Indian defense opening line. Bishop b4. Indian defense, Nimzo Indian defense opening line. The Nimzo Indian was popularized by Nimzovich as a plan to gain control of e4 by trading white's queen's knight in conjunction with the Indian fianchetto of the queen's bishop. Knight f3. Indian defense, Nimzo Indian defense, 3 knights variation, opening line. d6. Out of opening book, d5, would have been in the Indian defense, Nimzo Indian defense, 3 knights variation, book opening. Queen c2. Castle kingside. Bishop g5. Pins black's knight at f6 and makes way for a castle to the queen side. Knight c6. a3. Attacks black's bishop at b4. Bishop takes c3 check, partially pins white's pawn at b2 and checks white's king. Queen takes c3. Frees the pin on white's pawn at b2 and removes the threat on white's king. White wins a bishop for a knight. Material is even. h6. Threatens white's bishop at g5. Bishop h4. Moves it to safety. Rook e8. Castle queenside.
Suggesting, be it ever so subtly, that he might be interested in going for a kingside attack.
Bishop d7. e3. e5. Queen c2. a6. Bishop d3. g5. Frees the pin on black's knight at f6 and attacks white's bishop at h4. D takes e5. Attacks black's knight at f6. Knight takes e5. Protects black's knight at f6. Knight takes e5. Rook takes e5. Black wins a knight and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. Material is even. f4. Threatens black's rook at e5.
That Keymar missed this suggests that he wasn't in very good form in this tournament, either, and indeed, he finished half a point from the bottom.
Rook c5. Moves it to safety and blocks white's pawn at c4. b4. Attacks black's rook at c5. Rook c6. Moves it to safety. F takes g5. Removes the threat on white's bishop at h4. Forks black's knight and black's pawn at h6 and isolates black's pawn at f7 and black's pawn at h6. White wins a pawn. knight g4. Moves it to safety, pins white's pawn at g5, removes the threat on black's pawn at h6, and threatens white's pawn at e3. Bishop h7, check. Removes the threat on white's pawn at e3 and checks black's king. King f8. Moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at e3. Rook h f1. Queen e7. g6. Pins black's pawn at f7 with a partial pin and attacks black's queen. f6. Removes the threat on black's queen. h3. Moves it to safety and attacks black's knight. d5. Hangs the pawn at d5. Leads to h takes g4, bishop takes g4, rook takes d5, queen takes e3, check, king b2, queen e7, rook d4, bishop e2, rook f5, b5, rook e4, rook takes c4, rook takes f6, check, queen takes f6, check, bishop takes f6, rook takes c2, check, king takes c2, which wins a queen, a rook, and 3 pawns. 4. A queen, a rook, a knight, and 2 pawns. Better is knight takes e3, leading to rook d e1, knight takes c2, rook takes e7, king takes e7, rook takes f6, bishop takes h3, rook f7, check, king e6, rook e7, check, king f5, g7, check, king g4, rook e4, check, king h5, g takes h3, d5, c takes d5, which wins a queen, a rook, and 2 pawns. 4. A queen, a bishop, and 2 pawns. This was black's critical error in the game. Black did recover, but was later mated. H takes g4. Rook takes c4. Leads to queen takes c4, d takes c4, bishop takes f6, queen takes e3, check, rook d2, king e8, g7, queen takes d2, check, king takes d2, bishop e6, g8, queen, check, bishop takes g8, bishop takes g8, b5, rook h1, king d7, bishop h7, c5, rook takes h6, c takes b4, a takes b4. Better is a5, leading to rook takes d5, bishop takes g4, g7, check, queen takes g7, b5, rook e6, queen d3, rook a e8, rook d7, which gains a queen, a rook, a bishop, and 2 pawns, and loses a queen, a rook, and 2 pawns in comparison. Rook takes f6, check. Leads to queen takes f6, bishop takes f6, rook takes c2, check, king takes c2, bishop a4, check, king c1, bishop takes d1, king takes d1, rook e8, g7, check, king f7, g5, h takes g5, g8, queen, check, rook takes g8, bishop takes g8, check, king takes g8, bishop takes g5, king f7, bishop f4, c6. Better is queen takes c4, leading to d takes c4, bishop takes f6, queen takes e3, check, rook d2, king e8, g7, queen takes d2, check, king takes d2, bishop e6, g8, queen, check, bishop takes g8, bishop takes g8, b5, rook h1, king d7, bishop h7, c5, rook takes h6, c takes b4, A takes b4, which gains a rook, a bishop, and a pawn, and loses a rook and a pawn in comparison. White's only meaningful error of the game gave away a 1 position, but White was later able to manage a mate anyway. King e8 leads to g7. Rook takes c2, check. King takes c2. Queen takes g7. Bishop g6, check. Queen takes g6, check. Rook takes g6. Bishop a4, check. King d3. Bishop takes d1. Rook g8, check. King d7. Rook takes a8. Bishop takes g4, e4. King d6. Better is Queen takes f6, leading to Bishop takes f6, Rook takes c2, check. King takes c2, Bishop a4, check. King c1, Bishop takes d1, King takes d1, Rook e8, g7, check. King f7, g5, h takes g5, g8, Queen, check. Rook takes g8, Bishop takes g8, check. King takes g8, Bishop takes g5, King f7, Bishop f4, c6, which gains a rook and loses a bishop and a pawn by comparison. g7 threatens Black's pawn at h6 and adds a promote threat at g7. Rook takes c2, check. Partially pins White's pawn at g7, skewers White's pawn at g7, removes the threat on Black's pawn at h6 and Black's pawn at d5, and forks White's pawn at g2 and White's king. Bishop takes c2. Frees White's pawn at g7 from the pin, protects White's pawn at g2 and White's king, and forks Black's pawn at h6 and Black's pawn at d5. Queen takes g7. Leads to Bishop g6, check. Queen takes g6, Rook takes g6, King f7, Rook f6, check. King g7, Rook takes d5, Bishop c6, Rook e5, Rook e8, Rook takes e8, Bishop takes e8, Rook e6, Bishop c6, Rook e7, check. King g6, Rook takes c7, Bishop takes g2, which wins a rook, a bishop, and 2 pawns, for a queen, a rook, and 2 pawns. Better is Bishop e6, leading to Bishop g6, check. King d7, Bishop f5, Queen takes f6, Bishop takes f6, King d6, Rook h1, Bishop g8, Bishop d4, King e7, Rook takes h6, Rook d8, which wins a rook, for a queen and a pawn.
White is hardly down in material and his pieces are so active, and Black's king can't castle, that even without a knockout blow he'd be winning. There is a knockout blow, however.
Bishop g6, check. Removes the threat on White's pawn at g4 and checks Black's king. King e7. Black steps into the forced mate. Much better is Queen takes g6. King e7 leads to Rook takes a6, check. Queen f6. Bishop takes f6, check. King f8. Rook takes a8, check. Bishop e8. Rook takes e8, and checkmate. Rook takes a6, check. White circles in for the kill, with a mate in 3. Removes the threat on White's pawn at g4 and forks Black's rook and Black's king. Leads to Queen f6, Bishop takes f6, check. King f8, Rook takes a8, check. Bishop e8, Rook takes e8, and checkmate. King f8. moves it out of check and forks white's rook at a6 and white's pawn at g4. Rook takes a8 check. White has a mate in 1. Protects white's pawn at g4 and checks black's king. Leads to bishop e8. Rook takes e8 and mate. Bishop e8 removes the threat on black's king and attacks white's bishop at g6. Rook takes e8 checkmate. Checkmates black's king.